about. And this is a talk by Tahra Eissa. And so Tahra, take it away.
Thank you. So I would just like to start actually by putting us in the mindset of what I mean when we say these rare event inferences. So let's just imagine for a moment that we're a doctor and we have a patient and we're worried about whether or not this patient has epilepsy. And the way we usually diagnose epilepsy is whether or not we observe a seizure. And so we send the patient home, we say, take a log of whether or not you think you've had a seizure. A week goes by, they come back, no seizures. We may think, oh, okay, this patient doesn't have epilepsy. Another week goes by, they come back, and now they've said that they have one seizure. So now as the doctor, we have a question. Does this patient have epilepsy? And does that one seizure, how much do we weigh that? And so I want to take a moment to really point out two caveats to these rare event situations. So the first one is we often have very limited information. As I just showed you with the 1 week's worth of information, there's a good chance that we might not see a rare event. So we might misestimate its occurrence or its frequency. And the second thing I want to point out is that when we do see that seizure, not all of the information we have should be weighed the same. Obviously, seeing one seizure is much more informative than all the days that we don't see a seizure. So now the question that we're left with is, well, how do we know how to weigh this? How should our evidence be weighed? So the way that we wanted to approach this question was in the form of a jars task. So in this task, we have a set of jars, and within these jars, there's different ratios of blue and red balls. And what we're doing is we're going to draw with replacement a small number of balls, 2 to 10 balls. And then the observer has to say, do I think that it came from one jar or the other? Now, what we're going to do to vary this and ask about rare events is to actually consider two types of jars. Asymmetric jars are going to have one color ball, here red, to be rare in both jars. And so this is just like the seizure. If we do observe a red ball, that's going to give us a lot more information about the jar than not observing a red ball. In contrast, if we have symmetric jars, the ratio of balls are going to be reciprocals between the two jars. So if I see a red ball, it gives me as much information in favor of one jar as seeing a blue ball gives me in favor of the other jar. So another way to visualize this would just be to think about, here are our ball draws. And when we see a red ball, we see that this gives us more information. It shifts our belief more so towards a higher jar, what we call our H+ jar, than in the symmetric case. So using this setup, the first question we asked was, how would an ideal Bayesian observer approach this question? And so we can consider this in terms of three main components of our model. So the first thing is we're going to set up our prior and say the ideal observer knows each jar is equally likely on any given trial. So there's no biases. The second part is now we can actually define an evidence weight. Because we've actually said that this H value tells us the probability of picking a particular red ball, we can compute that as saying, well, what is the probability of observing a red ball or a blue ball in either jar? And then the last component is our actual decision rule. So we're going to update this using a log likelihood ratio in which every ball drawn is going to give us a piece of information. And at the end, our belief, which here is labeled as Zn, if it's positive, then that's going to motivate us to report it's the H+ jar, that less rare jar in our asymmetric case. And if it's less than 0, we're going to report H-. So using this model, the first question we asked was, what happens if you give the observer many, many trials? What we would expect is that over time, the number of responses would begin to match the prior, meaning we'd have about half of our responses in favor of the H+ jar, half of our responses in favor of H-. But what we found was actually really interesting, which was that in the symmetric jars, we do get that response fraction that you'd expect. But in the asymmetric jars, there was actually a bias, and you have more responses in favor of that more extreme H- jar. And so this is a pretty surprising finding, given that this is supposed to be an optimal observer. So the question we asked was, well, do humans show the same bias? So in order to answer that question, we expanded this task slightly, and we used Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourcing platform, to poll subjects on these exact same tasks. So what we've done now is set up 5 blocks of jars, and we varied the difficulty and the symmetry. So just a quick rundown, we have a control, hard asymmetric, hard symmetric, easy asymmetric, and an easy symmetric. I'm not sure if you guys can actually see the laser pointer. Can you see this now? Okay. So in this particular case, we asked subjects if they could do the same task. And what we found was that just like we saw with our ideal observer, in these asymmetric blocks, subjects were showing the same sort of a bias. They were also reporting the H- jar more often than they should be. And taking this even one step further, I want to go back to what we said about limited information causing biases. We had given them 3 distinct numbers of balls to observe. They could see 2 balls, 5 balls, or 10 balls. And just in line with what we'd expect, we see that when they only had 2 balls, they see a more extreme bias, more responses in favor of the H- jar, which is in line with what you'd expect, since observing a rare ball in the asymmetric case would be very rare then. So this left us with the question of whether or not the biases that are causing this response fraction were the same in human subjects as in our ideal observer. Was it truly caused by the same mechanism? And one of the motivations for this was because we know that humans also show repetition biases and sequence biases when you're doing trial after trial responses. So there is a clever way to actually distinguish between different types of biases. And so what we did was look at a block of trials, and you can actually go through trial by trial and compare the sequences of responses. So for each pair, here we see there would be an alternation from H+ to H-, followed by a repetition from H- to H- again. And when you actually quantify the frequency of each of these responses, you can compare them to one another. So here, if I plot how often I alternate in either direction, you can get a sense of whether or not you have particular biases. So if you don't alternate in either case very often, then you're more likely to repeat your answers. You have a repetition bias. If you alternate often, an alternation bias. But across on the downward diagonal, we also can consider whether or not I have an item bias. Do I prefer one particular jar? And so we used this and plotted where do our subjects fall in these different categories. And what we see is very reassuring in terms of we see these orange points are our symmetric trials, and they're very close to the center, which is actually where we would have unbiased space. These green points, in contrast, are our asymmetric blocks, and they show very distinctly a preference for the H- jar, the more extreme jar. So now we've confirmed that this bias is really coming from very similar motivations as our ideal observer. But since we know the ideal observer shows a bias, we're now left with the question of, is this bias the same? Is that all that we're seeing? Are they just doing the optimal thing? So we gave ideal observers the same trials as each subject and normalized to see how similar they really were. And what we saw was that our symmetric trials, again, all of our subjects were very close to being very similar to the ideal observer. But what was quite surprising is there was a large number of subjects that still had an enhanced bias, even beyond what we expected. So this really asks the question then, what's causing that enhanced bias? So in order to get at this, we decided to use model fitting and model comparison. And so the first question is, are even using Bayesian methods? So I'm not going to go through all of the models, but we tested out 4 different Bayesian type models. And the main important point was this noisy Bayesian model, where we said, what is the actual weight you're giving to a rare ball? And then some alternative options. Perhaps you are doing things just like the ideal observer. Perhaps you are applying a prior, and maybe you're not even using all of the information. And then the other set of models that we considered were some heuristics. Maybe you're just guessing. And then these 2 were what we call rare ball models, where if you saw any rare balls at all, then with some probability, you're going to respond for a particular jar. And so using these model comparisons, what we found was most of our subjects fell within these Bayesian models. But really importantly, they were not necessarily using optimal approaches. And so we wanted to take this one step further and now go back to that and say, well, what were those enhanced subjects doing? What best fit model did they have? And so if I just plot those same plots we see before, but with the models that best fit our subjects, we see that there's 2 really distinct groups that are shifted up this diagonal. The first one are those noisy Bayesian subjects. And what's really important about this is that that shift seems to be caused by the rare ball weight. So here, these black lines are actually showing where the ideal observer believes we should set the weight for a rare ball. And we can see that as you have more and more of this enhanced H- response, you're weighing these rare balls less and less. And then the second one are people who actually have a prior. And so there is also some innate bias towards these more rare options. So in summary, I just want to bring back what our main findings here were. So we saw that both the ideal observer and human subjects showed a bias towards more extreme versions in rare event decision-making, and that subjects did appear to be using a Bayesian, but not necessarily optimal approach to these problems. And this is what was actually causing us to have an enhanced preference for these rare balls or these rare events. And that was often caused by underweighing the rare events themselves or having innate biases. So I'd just like to thank all of my collaborators at the University of Colorado Boulder, Houston, and Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahra. That was great. It was very, very clearly presented. Thank you, and everyone's been presenting beautifully today. Very clear talks, and I would like to ask people in the audience to ask some questions and of these interesting presentations. I was just thinking about, as you were presenting, Tahra, I was thinking about why people go out and buy those lottery tickets.
Yes.
And, you were talking about seizures, and that's something that I can relate to because I used to test epilepsy surgery patients, and those are rare events. They are rare events, but lottery tickets is another thing, and lightning strikes as well. Lightning strikes on a golf course is another one where people go out and play golf. But my question to you is, how does the mental affective state of a person affect this kind of decision making? Do you have a sense of that? And let me tell you what I'm saying, what I'm thinking. If somebody is more depressed, is that likely to change their the bias that they've got in this with these kinds of decisions?
That's an excellent question. And our data cannot directly speak to that since it is crowdsourced and we didn't ask any questions about emotional or mental state. But There have been studies that have shown people are much better at assessing negative rare events than positive, and we actually have different biases based on those particular situations. The other component is actually experience versus if you're doing this based in probability. So oftentimes experience can greatly shift these biases. And so in some cases, you actually see the complete opposite bias based solely on how you structure these types of tasks.
That's interesting. And the other thing, as you were answering my question, it made me think of how younger and older people look at things as well. How older people, I'm told, have a more positive, may make more positive outlook on things, and maybe make more positive decisions than people who are younger. There's again something to look into, age differences. But we have a question from Joseph de Souza, and who says that was a lovely talk. But his question is, how about one trial learning in children, and can this be modeled?
Ooh, that is a good question. The short answer is I would have to think about it. I think, well, first of all, we were only dealing with adults in this particular case. And so I think that even going back to your comment about age, right? And as you age, you have different experiences. I think it's very difficult to compare this type of a task to something in children only because of the developmental and the experiential portion of it, right? So whether or not we like to admit it, this task comes with some amount of bias built in from people automatically having experiences. So perhaps if we restructured it, then we could maybe get at some of those other questions, but not in its current state, I guess.
Okay, so some remodeling of the task, no pun intended. All right, well, on that note, I think it's time to draw it to a close. And I'd like to thank all of the presenters for doing presenting beautifully clear slides. It was an absolute pleasure to watch this. And I'd also like to thank Siddharth Suresh, who did an absolutely fabulous job navigating the back end for us. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of Neuro.